He was not born to rule, but ruled like no one else. He was the second son, once destined for the church, but fate handed him a crown, and he wielded it like a sword. He turned churches into rubble, lovers into corpses, and a fragile crown into an empire of fear and faith. He wasn't just a king. He was the storm that tore through England, reshaping its religion, its monarchy, and its soul. This is not just the tale of a monarch. It is a sweeping saga of obsession and ambition, of love and lust, of betrayal, blood, and power. It's the story of a man who shattered the world around him just to satisfy his desire for a son, and left behind a nation forever transformed. A man who broke from Rome, crushed centuries-old traditions, and created a church in his own image. A man who married 6 women and executed 2 of them. A king who ruled not only with a crown, but with terror. This is Henry VIII, the tyrant king. And whether you admire him or fear him, one thing is certain: you will never forget him. The throne was his, but the cost was everything. Before Henry VIII, there was his father, Henry VII, the man who built the throne his son would one day shake. Henry VII was born Henry Tudor, and he came from the House of Lancaster. But during his youth, England was caught in a brutal civil war called the Wars of the Roses, a fight for the crown between 2 powerful royal families, Lancaster and York. For over 30 years, these families battled each other. It was a war of cousins, with Lancaster's red rose on one side and York's white rose on the other. Thousands died, and the country was left divided and bleeding. Henry Tudor had to flee England as a boy. He lived in exile for years. But in 1485, he returned to fight for his claim to the throne. At the famous Battle of Bosworth, he defeated King Richard III of York, ending the war and becoming King Henry VII. To secure the fragile peace he had won on the battlefield, Henry VII did something no conqueror had ever done before. He married the daughter of his enemy, Elizabeth of York, the niece of the slain King Richard III and heir of the rival House of York. It was a political masterstroke and a powerful symbol. The red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York became one, the Tudor rose, a new emblem for a united England. Their marriage wasn't born of passion, but of purpose, a calculated hope that the bloodshed could finally end. Together, they became a living truce. 2 houses, 1 crown. And from this union came a dynasty. 4 children survived infancy, including Prince Arthur, their golden heir, and a second son, a curious, charismatic boy named Henry, a boy born in peace, but destined to bring thunder. Born in the summer of 1491, at the Palace of Placentia in Greenwich, a boy named Henry Tudor entered the world not as a future monarch, but as a second son, a child raised in comfort, not in expectation. In this soft-lit nursery of royal tapestries and velvet cradles, no one imagined that this boy would one day wear the crown of England. While his older brother prepared for kingship, young Henry spent his days surrounded by music, tutors, and pageantry. He watched from afar as knights trained in the royal gardens, wide-eyed with wonder, blissfully unaware that fate was quietly rewriting his story. His education was rich and refined: theology, languages, music, law, a curriculum fit for a prince, not a king. But Henry VIII was no ordinary youth. Even then, he showed a mind as sharp as his sword would one day become, and a charm that would one day seduce courts and kingdoms alike. All eyes were on Prince Arthur, the heir, the golden hope of the Tudor dynasty. From birth, he had been shaped for kingship, polished, educated, and prepared to rule. At just 15, he was married in a grand ceremony to Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess of royal blood, daughter of the mighty monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. Catherine was more than a bride. She was a powerful alliance, a symbol of England's rising influence in European affairs. While Arthur basked in ceremony and promise, young Henry lingered in the background, unnoticed, yet silently watching history unfold. But then came tragedy. In a cold spring of 1502, Arthur fell ill and died. Suddenly, the world shifted. The throne, once so far away, loomed large. In a quiet, candlelit chapel, a teenage Henry mourned his brother and inherited his future. Soon after, Henry was brought before the court and formally named Prince of Wales, the new heir. Standing beside his father, King Henry VII, the teenage prince bore the weight of a crown he was never meant to wear. He threw himself into preparation in body and mind, swordsmanship, jousting, diplomacy, philosophy. He trained not just to inherit a crown, but to command it. He grew tall and strong, with a charismatic presence that captivated those around him. His tutors nurtured a sharp intellect. Henry devoured the works of theologians and scholars, developing his own views on kingship, divinity, and power, ideas that would one day reshape the nation. By his late teens, Henry was already exercising influence. He moved gracefully among nobles and foreign envoys, his confidence unmistakable. Diplomacy came as naturally to him as dancing or debating. In 1509, death returned, this time to the old king himself. Henry VII's passing marked the end of one reign and the beginning of another. Beside his father's bed, the young prince stood in mourning and in readiness. In the spring of 1509, a new sun rose over England. At just 17 years old, Henry VIII was crowned king, a monarch radiant with youth, charm, and boundless energy. Dressed in glittering robes beneath the soaring arches of Westminster Abbey, he symbolized a fresh chapter for the realm. His coronation was more than ceremony. It was a promise of glory. He took to power like a natural, commanding his first court session with presence beyond his years. His youthful face bore no trace of fear, only determination. In the streets of London, people flooded to catch a glimpse of their new king. He was handsome, vigorous, the very image of Renaissance royalty. England rejoiced, hopeful for peace, promise, and prosperity under this radiant new monarch. But behind the pageantry, a young man stood at his window, quietly surveying the kingdom he now ruled. He was poised at the edge of greatness and of chaos. The storm had not yet begun, but it was coming. Soon after, Henry VIII married Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess and widow of his late brother, Prince Arthur. The union brought strength to the Tudor dynasty and peace to the realm. Their wedding, beneath stained glass and golden altars, was seen as the perfect beginning to a golden age. The court celebrated with lavish feasts and pageantry. At the head of the banquet table, the young king radiated charisma, surrounded by nobles, music, laughter, and the aroma of abundance. Henry quickly embraced leadership. In the royal court session, he sat with confidence and regal bearing, issuing decrees, hearing petitions, and shaping policy. A young ruler stepping boldly into power. But beyond the grandeur, whispers already stirred in the palace corridors. As Henry walked through his Tudor halls, courtiers bowed with reverence, yet behind their eyes, ambition flickered. Some bowed in loyalty, others in calculation. In shadowed chambers, Thomas Wolsey, a brilliant and cunning cleric, began to rise. In private meetings with the king, he maneuvered himself into royal favor. A butcher's son turned political titan. His rise sparked envy in noble circles. While masks and entertainments dazzled the court, power games played on behind the scenes. Amid music and masked dancers, alliances formed under candlelight. Henry, ever the entertainer, smiled, unaware of every hidden glance and whispered plot. For a time, his marriage with Catherine was warm and harmonious. They strolled through palace gardens together, a king and queen in peace. But beneath that peace, a storm slowly gathered. Henry charmed foreign ambassadors with diplomatic finesse, reinforcing England's growing influence. He stood tall in audience chambers, balancing political interests with the grace of a seasoned statesman. Yet Henry longed to be seen not just as a diplomat, but a warrior king. He paraded before troops, donned armor, and led bold, though not always successful, campaigns in France. He craved the glory of conquest like his forefathers. In 1520, Henry staged the most extravagant display of royal power Europe had ever seen, the Field of the Cloth of Gold. Beneath golden tents and flowing banners, he met with Francis I of France, flaunting England's wealth and prestige in a festival of jousting, wine fountains, and glittering armor. But beneath the silk and celebration, it was a contest of ego, not alliance. Behind closed doors, the young king's confidence gave way to quiet moments of doubt. In solitary reflection, he began to feel the weight of kingship, its pressures beginning to press in on him. He began to observe more closely. Whispers in corridors, glances among courtiers, gestures too subtle to ignore. Power shifted from feast to feast, chamber to chamber. Nobles maneuvered, rivals grew bold, and ambitions simmered beneath the silks. Tensions reached boiling point. In a heated council, Henry stood at the forefront of decision-making. Fierce, frustrated, increasingly impatient with the limits of diplomacy and the weight of opinion. His voice echoed through council halls, his will growing iron-hard. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the velvet-lined chamber. The feast had ended, the courtiers had long since retired, but the king remained, alone, silent, and still. Henry VIII stood by the tall arched window, gazing out at the moonlit gardens below. His silhouette, once so bold and commanding, seemed softened now by the silver glow of night. His richly embroidered robes clung to him like the burdens he could no longer escape. In his hand he held a letter, unopened, unread. It could have been news from the Pope, a dispatch from Spain, or a whisper of another plot from within his court. But he didn't read it, not yet. Tonight, the noise of court politics had faded. The music was gone, the laughter, distant echoes, and in the silence, Henry faced the one adversary he could not outmatch: doubt. The throne had given him power, but it had taken something in return, innocence perhaps, or peace. His crown shone bright by day, but in the quiet of night it weighed heavy upon his soul. And as the moon climbed higher, the King of England stood alone, not in triumph, but in reflection. For all his splendor, glory, and grandeur, one fear gnawed relentlessly at Henry VIII, a fear greater than any rebellion, foreign threat, or courtly intrigue: the absence of a male heir. A king might conquer lands, crush dissent, and command the church, but without a son, his dynasty would crumble like dust beneath a crown. His queen, Catherine of Aragon, bore him child after child, but each ended in tragedy. Tiny cradles remained empty, swaddled in mourning cloth. Only one child survived, a daughter, Mary. Henry stood alone in solemn reflection, eyes fixed on a family portrait that showed only one daughter, no son. It wasn't just disappointment. It was divine judgment in his eyes, a sign from God, a curse. He prayed, begged, pleaded before God's altar for a son to secure his legacy. But heaven remained silent, and so his desperation grew. And then he saw her, a woman who stood apart from all others at court, sharp-witted, captivating, and enigmatic. Anne Boleyn, not just a beauty, but a force. Educated in the courts of Europe, she carried herself with a confidence and charm that was both foreign and irresistible. Henry had never encountered anyone quite like her. She wasn't merely beautiful, she was magnetic. As she danced beneath flickering torchlight, Henry couldn't look away. He was captivated. Anne was no ordinary court lady. She was intelligent, sharp-tongued, educated, and fearless. Their private conversations crackled with tension and wit. Henry showered her with attention and lavish gifts, but Anne would not be bought. She wore his necklace, yes, but never offered her heart. Their moments grew more intimate, whispered conversations behind columns, glances held too long. The court whispered, the queen watched, and Anne remained unmoved by flattery. The king, once cold in matters of love, now poured his passion onto parchment, writing letter after letter, obsessed, restless, consumed. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon had grown hollow, a union once defined by shared duty and dignity, now unraveling before the court's eyes. They sat together, yet miles apart. Henry, distracted and brooding. Catherine, solemn and still. Their silence echoed louder than any quarrel. Restlessness clung to Henry like a shadow. He wandered the corridors alone, his footsteps heavy with discontent. The weight of dissatisfaction pressed harder with each passing day. He was a king longing for something more, or perhaps someone else. In the quiet of his chamber he held letters he scarcely read. His thoughts were far from statecraft. They were consumed by a name that now lingered on his lips more than his queen's, Anne Boleyn. Her presence stirred something in him, not merely desire but purpose. She was no ordinary court lady. Anne moved with elegance and certainty, her wit as sharp as her eyes. To Henry she was a flame, brilliant, untouchable, and dangerously irresistible. His longing became obsession, and that obsession birthed conviction that his marriage to Catherine was not only loveless, but cursed. Anne was no longer just a woman. She became the axis on which his world began to turn. What started as forbidden passion soon became a movement. The personal turned political. The king's desire became a doctrine. And in the distance, a storm gathered, one that would shake the church, the crown, and all of England. Desperate for a son, Henry VIII turned not only to physicians and prayers, but to Scripture. Henry brought his dilemma to council and to Rome. He wasn't asking for a divorce in the modern sense. He wanted an annulment, a formal declaration that his marriage to Catherine of Aragon had never been valid in the eyes of God. He argued that his union was cursed, citing Leviticus, which warned that a man who marries his brother's widow would be childless. To Henry, the lack of a male heir wasn't just bad luck, it was divine judgment. But Catherine stood firm. With regal dignity and unshakable resolve, she declared before the court, clergy, and king that she had been a virgin when she married Henry's brother, Arthur. To her, this was not just a matter of marital status, it was a matter of truth, of honor, and of rightful queenship. If she had not consummated her first marriage, then by church law her union with Henry was valid, sacred and lawful in the eyes of God. And if her marriage to Henry was valid, then she remained his lawful wife and England's true queen. The Pope was in a difficult position. Catherine's nephew, Emperor Charles V, was very powerful and controlled much of Europe. Approving the annulment would anger him. The Pope didn't want to cause trouble, so he delayed. In the end, he refused Henry's request, afraid to offend Charles. Meanwhile, England fractured. The court split into bitter factions, some fiercely loyal to Catherine, others rallying behind Anne Boleyn, and others who saw in the chaos a chance to challenge the church itself. Cardinal Wolsey was Henry's most powerful advisor, but when he couldn't convince the Pope to approve the annulment, he lost the king's trust. Henry turned against him. Wolsey was removed from power, shamed, and died on his way to face trial, a fallen man before he reached the courtroom. Into the power vacuum stepped Thomas Cromwell, a self-made man from humble beginnings, brilliant, calculating, and fiercely ambitious. Unlike the noble-born advisors before him, Cromwell rose through intellect and strategy. He brought bold new ideas to the king and council, ideas that would soon reshape England forever. And beside him rose Thomas Cranmer, the soft-spoken but revolutionary reformist, appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, ready to reshape the spiritual order from within. Behind closed doors, the trio forged a new path, a revolution disguised as reform. Not just the end of a marriage, but the beginning of a new religious world. Parliament obeyed. Act by act, law by law, they severed England from Rome's grip. The realm began to redefine itself under royal command. Then came the final break. In 1534, a single stroke of Henry's pen shattered the spiritual order of centuries. Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, declaring Henry VIII, not the Pope, as supreme head of the Church of England. With ink and seal, England's allegiance shifted from Rome to the crown. What followed was no gentle reform. It was royal conquest, wrapped in religious pretense. Henry stood tall as monastic lands were seized, abbeys stripped of power, and church properties claimed by the crown. Thousands of monks, once guardians of faith and learning, were cast out into the cold, their vows disregarded, their sacred homes now claimed by royal decree. Gold chalices, silver plate, jeweled relics, all flowed into Henry's coffers. This wasn't just theology, it was treasury policy. The church's wealth became the king's fortune. Knowledge burned. Libraries, scrolls, illuminated manuscripts, the lifeblood of monastic learning, were reduced to ash under royal orders. And with each decree, Henry's grip tightened. Before Parliament, he stood not just as king, but as spiritual sovereign of the realm. Meanwhile, reformers flourished. In candlelit chambers, the Bible was translated into English, printed and passed hand to hand, village to village. Faith was no longer in Latin, it was in the people's tongue. But Henry's pride was never in doctrine, only power. And though he enabled reform, he watched it with suspicion, torn between control and chaos. Sir Thomas More, a brilliant scholar and once Henry's closest advisor, refused to accept the king as head of the church. Loyal to the Pope, he would not take the oath of supremacy. In 1535, he was executed for treason, declaring, "I die the king's good servant, but God's first." Now feared as much as revered, Henry sat on his throne, a monarch transformed. His word was law, his will absolute. But England was splintered. On one side, loyalists clung to the old church. On the other, reformers pressed forward, propelled by the king's very sword. In rare moments of solitude, Henry stood in reflection, a man who had torn apart the spiritual heart of his nation to secure his own legacy. Yet there was no slowing down. More laws were drafted. The new order was built in ink and blood, ensuring the king's vision outlived even his reign. The symbols changed too. Where once stood papal banners, now hung the Tudor rose and royal arms, a new era branded into every stone and scroll. And so the king who once defended the Pope's church now ruled with a sword over its ashes, rich in power, heavy with consequence, and utterly alone. Anne Boleyn's reign began in triumph. The court glittered with celebration. Lavish masks, music, and pageantry filled the royal halls. She was more than a queen, she was a symbol of change. In 1533, after Henry secretly married her, Catherine of Aragon was banished from court, stripped of her title. Anne had captured a king, defied tradition, and reshaped the very soul of the kingdom. But glory rarely lasts forever. In 1533, Anne gave birth to her first child, a girl, Princess Elizabeth. Henry had hoped for a son, but he welcomed the daughter with cautious optimism. Next time, he said, but next time never came. Anne Boleyn stood alone in the palace garden, her eyes filled with silent sorrow. Henry walked away without a word, burdened by disappointment. Each failed pregnancy shattered his hopes for a son, and Anne, once his obsession, now symbolized his frustration. Their bond unraveled, replaced by cold silence and fading affection. Her once admired confidence now seen as arrogance. Behind her, courtiers whispered of her miscarriages, her sharp tongue, and fading favor with the king. Once celebrated, she was now resented, a queen surrounded by smiles in public and daggers of envy in private. Thomas Cromwell, once Anne's ally, now whispered with her enemies in shadowed corners. Behind closed doors, a quiet betrayal unfolded. the first stirrings of a political storm that would seal her fate. Frustrated by her failure to produce a son and swayed by court factions, Henry turned cold. With Cromwell's help, charges of adultery, incest, and treason were fabricated. In 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested. It was a command from the king himself. She was imprisoned in the Tower of London. The charges were shocking, the evidence weak, but the outcome was never in doubt. Her fall had been written not in law, but in political necessity. On the scaffold at the Tower of London, Anne faced her fate with remarkable dignity. Calm and composed, she spoke her final words, not in bitterness, but with grace. Moments later, the executioner's sword ended her brief, turbulent reign. From a palace window, Henry VIII watched in silence, his face unreadable. Anne was gone, her crown lost to the axe. No mourning followed, only cold resolve and the search for an heir. In a bustling court full of ambition and intrigue, Jane Seymour entered Henry VIII's life softly, a gentle presence amid the thunder of palace politics. He first noticed her from across the grand hall, modest, composed, and unlike any woman who came before. Jane had quietly served as lady-in-waiting to both Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, watching the rise and fall of queens with careful eyes. While others sought attention, Jane's silence spoke volumes. Her piety, humility, and gentle manner began to draw Henry's gaze. Their courtship unfolded in hushed moments and brief exchanges. A conversation in a palace corridor marked the beginning of something deeper. Henry, disillusioned with Anne's boldness, found solace in Jane's simplicity. In 1536, just days after Anne Boleyn's execution, Henry married Jane Seymour in a solemn, intimate ceremony. She became his third queen, a fresh beginning wrapped in quiet hope. Not long after, Jane became pregnant. At court, she was celebrated as the queen who might finally deliver England its future king. Henry's anticipation grew. This time, he believed, destiny was on his side. In 1537, Jane gave birth to Edward VI, the long-awaited male heir. Henry was overjoyed. He had his son. His throne was secured. His legacy, at last, was alive in a cradle. But the joy was brief. Jane grew ill soon after childbirth, weakened by postnatal complications. Her glow faded, and shadows fell over the royal bedchamber. Henry grieved deeply. In the stillness of a chapel, he mourned not just a wife, but the one woman who had fulfilled his greatest hope, only to vanish before the future could unfold. At Edward's baptism, Jane was absent, her death hanging heavy over the celebration. The kingdom rejoiced for a prince, but the king's heart carried the weight of loss. Years later, Henry returned to her tomb, not just as a king, but as a man. She was the only queen he chose to be buried beside, a lasting symbol of love, loss, and legacy. After Jane Seymour's death, Henry VIII turned to diplomacy over desire. A new bride was chosen, Anne of Cleves, a German Protestant princess, selected to forge stronger ties with reformist Europe. Henry admired her portrait, painted by Holbein, elegant, noble, promising. But the portrait had deceived him. When Anne finally arrived in England, Henry was horrified by her appearance, famously calling her the Flanders mare. There was no spark, no passion, only disappointment. Even at court, the disconnect was palpable. Henry and Anne appeared together at formal gatherings, seated apart, emotionally distant, their union reduced to mere obligation. The marriage was swiftly annulled. But Anne of Cleves proved wiser than most. She accepted her fate with grace, signing away her crown in exchange for comfort, status, and peace. She was granted estates, wealth, and the honorary title of King's Sister. Unlike others, Anne survived Henry, living out her days in luxury and dignity, one of the few who walked away from his court unscathed. But Henry's next choice would prove disastrous. At a court celebration, He noticed Catherine Howard, just 16 years old, youthful and alluring. She was Anne Boleyn's cousin, and she quickly enchanted the aging king. They married soon after. The wedding united a weary, aging king with a vibrant teenage bride. But beneath the surface, shadows stirred. Whispers echoed through the palace halls. Courtiers gossiped in hushed tones about Catherine's indiscretions, past lovers, secret meetings, a storm waiting to erupt. Eventually, the truth surfaced. Catherine was arrested in her royal chambers. Shock and terror etched her face as Henry stood apart, silent, cold, already turning the page. Alone in his chamber, Henry VIII sat heavier, older, and more isolated than ever before. His heart bore the weight of 5 marriages, betrayals, and regret. The once vibrant king was now a paranoid shadow of his former self, haunted by memories and by the queens who came and went like ghosts through his reign. Henry VIII's 6th and final wife was unlike any who came before her. Catherine Parr, a woman of intellect, composure, and reformist faith, entered Henry's life not as a conquest, but as a companion. She was a published author, fluent in theology and literature, and well-versed in navigating the complexities of a fractured court. As the king's health declined, Catherine became his caregiver, tending to his wounds, calming his moods, and restoring dignity to a man crumbling beneath the weight of age and legacy. More than a nurse, Catherine became a healer of the royal family. She reunited Henry with his estranged daughters, Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth, bringing a moment of peace to a family torn by years of division and betrayal. But within the palace walls, the kingdom teetered. Protestant reformers and Catholic conservatives clashed, vying for power in a court filled with tension and intrigue. Catherine's influence extended beyond healing. She became a mentor to the next generation, guiding young Edward and Elizabeth in thought, faith, and duty. Meanwhile, Henry, once the golden Renaissance prince, sat alone, a shadow of his former self. Obese, plagued by leg ulcers, and increasingly paranoid, he watched his world shrink behind the walls of a palace filled with ghosts. Gone was the glittering monarch. What remained was a tired, bloated figure haunted by his reign, by executions, broken alliances, and 6 queens who passed through his storm. In his final years, Henry VIII sat heavy on his throne, no longer the vibrant prince of his youth, but a solitary figure surrounded by silence and shadow. His reign had reshaped England, and yet it left behind a trail of blood and brilliance. The halls of his memory were crowded. 6 wives, countless advisers, and trusted friends, many of whom met a bitter end. Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, their faces haunted the walls, reminders of a king who ruled with passion and punishment alike. Henry's crown, heavy with power, was also stained with sacrifice. He expanded royal authority, shattered the church's grip, and centralized government. Yet his rule was laced with fear, execution, and upheaval. In January 1547, Henry VIII took his final breath. Surrounded by courtiers and Catherine Parr, he left behind a court steeped in rivalry, a nation divided, and a boy king yet unprepared. He left behind 3 children, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth, each destined to shape England in their own image. But none would carry the same storm of drama and legend as their father. And so Henry VIII became more than a king. He became myth. A man remembered not for peace, but for power. Not for harmony, but for upheaval. He didn't just change England. He changed kingship itself. At just 9 years old, Edward VI inherited the crown, draped in robes far too heavy for his shoulders, both literally and symbolically. The future of England now rested in fragile, youthful hands. Thank you for watching our deep dive into the life of Henry VIII, the king who shattered a kingdom to follow his will. We hope you enjoyed the journey through court intrigue, love, betrayal, and transformation. If you found this story compelling, please like the video, subscribe for more in-depth historical documentaries, and share it with fellow history lovers. Tell us in the comments, was Henry a visionary monarch or a tyrant consumed by power? Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep history alive.